welcome to another edition of Paydirt Remote. I'm Michael Washbourne, Senior Journalist with Paydirt Media. Today I'm joined by Steve Prominence, Managing Director of Lake Resources, to talk about all things to do with the lithium sector in Argentina. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you reaching out in these difficult times. We're all trying to work out how best to manage things, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and speaking of these difficult times, how is Lake Resources managing the situation both on the ground in Argentina, but also back here at your base in Australia?
Well, we're fortunate in that, first of all, the impact has been quite limited from COVID-19 on Lake. Although our projects in Argentina are advancing, we have a small team on the ground there and a much smaller one here in Australia. We're quite familiar with being set up remotely. Our focus at the moment is getting samples out of the pilot plant in the USA and having those distributed to potential off-takers. So that doesn't necessarily impact on what's happening on Argentina. We certainly don't want to slow things up, and we've looked at critical timelines. However, the first priority naturally is the health and well-being of our team and the general community, and we're trying to protect our staff and contractors while still delivering on key things on a critical timeline so that we don't end up being 6 months behind.
And Argentina recently announced a range of incentives to support the lithium sector during this time. Do you have any updates there and potentially how they'll have a benefit for Lake Resources?
The federal government announced that they were initiating a new law for the support of both the petroleum and the mining sector, and of the mining sector, particularly the lithium sector. And that was to stimulate new investment, new technology, while respecting environmental standards and including local participation and training, things like that. Since then, we've had the impact of coronavirus, but recent correspondence has continued support for foreign investment. For our investors, this government support should provide increased confidence in both the regulatory environment that we're operating, and also that Argentina's federal government and the 3 provinces where the lithium brines are continue to recognise the importance of the lithium sector in generating jobs, in bringing in foreign investment, and most importantly in creating exports in US dollars.
And many familiar with Lake Resources would be aware that 2020 was to be heavily focused on the pilot plant. Have you got an update on how that testing process is undergoing and what the next steps will be once that's complete?
The long and short of it, the testing's progressing well, and albeit we've got some delays with COVID-19 just at the moment, that's affected everything everywhere in the world, but it's still progressing quite well. The catchy brines from Argentina are at the pilot plant, so that means that we can produce lithium chloride, get that converted to lithium carbonate and get those off to off-takers. And then once all of that is completed, the plan is to move the pilot plant to site in Argentina. What's significant is that we continue to work very closely with our technology partner, which is Lilac Solutions out of the US. And the aim is not to just produce high purity lithium at the low end of the cost curve, but also to develop something that's sustainable with lithium and scalable, using this direct extraction technology for lithium brines. It's something different. Lilac has recently been backed by global heavyweights, including household names like Bill Gates, who led the Breakthrough Fund. These investors recognize the importance of sustainability, and that's what we're trying to achieve with this new process of the Catchy project.
And just on the corporate side, you touched on there that Bill Gates has led a big team of investors. I think some of the others in that group were Jack Ma and Jeff Bezos and Michael Bloomberg. So what does it mean, I guess, to have such big names associated with a company that's going to have a big say in how your project gets off the ground?
Having investors of that caliber, that speaks volumes for the technology and also for its potential. These investors made their fortunes investing in disruption. They recognized that Lilac's technology could be disruptive to the lithium brine industry and also producing something that's sustainable and scalable while producing a premium product. Markets always say, follow the money. Here's a classic example. When someone well-known with considerable funds selects the direct extraction technology and of the providers, Lilac, that shows that third-party advocacy speaks volumes. Our task now is to prove that value of the technology by getting the samples into the hands of the off-takers, getting that pilot plant operating successfully, feeding that into a full feasibility study, and then being able to jointly pitch to some of the large electric vehicle makers. And they're the ones who are really looking for sustainability in the supply chain. We saw just before Christmas BMW seek that. In February, we saw Daimler and Volkswagen seeking sustainable lithium in the supply chain. So if you've got a premium product and you've got something that's at the low end of the cost curve with a sustainability angle, and you've got large investors who think that that particular technology stands out over and above others, that's a pretty unusual and a pretty sweet spot to be in.
And Lake also recently just completed a placement to get some funds to do work this quarter. Tell me a little about some of the work programs that you've got coming up.
So as I just mentioned, our first focus is to get samples out of that pilot plant and into the hands of the off-takers. Separately, fairly soon we'll have our pre-feasibility study out, and then the next body of work will be completing a financing that we announced last October. We were looking for US 20 to 25 million. Maybe it'll be a little smaller given where the capital markets are at the moment, but the idea was to get a form of a debt funding to take this through into financing for moving into commercial production. Separately, we'll also be initiating, after the PFS, we'll be initiating the key body of work for a definitive feasibility study and environmental studies, those sorts of things, and that's where some of that funding is going. So that funding is going to be then for a range of those things to demonstrate that we can get on that critical timeline. And as I mentioned, basically not lose 6 months, but keep ahead of this curve. Steve,
thanks very much for joining us today, and all the best for the rest of 2020.
Thanks so much, Michael. I really appreciate it, and all the best to you guys. You know, as we look across the space, I think that you know, all the sectors have suffered from COVID-19, but the EV, the energy storage sector, still needs lithium batteries.